The city streets were quiet that evening, except for the occasional siren in the distance. The local hospital's brightest resident doctor was wrapping up his evening shift, doing his final rounds before heading home. At just 28, he had already earned a reputation for being one of the most promising medical students in the state, known for his quick thinking and calm demeanor under pressure. As he walked through the parking lot, keys jingling in his hand, he heard screams coming from around the corner. Without hesitation, he dropped his bag and ran toward the sound. There he found a man lying on the sidewalk, bleeding heavily from what appeared to be a gunshot wound. The victim's friends had fled the scene, scared of getting involved with the police. The young doctor immediately knelt beside the injured man, using his medical training to apply pressure to the wound. "Stay with me," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. He pulled out his phone with his free hand, dialing 911 while keeping pressure on the wound. But fate had other plans that night. As police sirens approached, several officers jumped out of their vehicles with weapons drawn. Instead of seeing a doctor trying to save a life, they saw what they wanted to see: another crime scene in a neighborhood that had been plagued by violence. "Hands where we can see them," they shouted, their flashlights blinding the young doctor. He tried to explain, his hands covered in the victim's blood. "I'm a doctor. I'm trying to help him." But his words fell on deaf ears. The officers roughly pulled him away from the injured man, forcing him face down onto the cold concrete. The real shooter was long gone, but the police had found their suspect. They didn't bother to check his hospital ID badge, still clipped to his shirt. They ignored the medical equipment scattered around him that he pulled from his bag in his desperate attempt to save a life. They didn't want to hear about his years of dedicated service at the hospital or his spotless record. Back at the precinct, things went from bad to worse. The detective in charge had already made up his mind. He saw the blood on the young doctor's hands and clothes as evidence of guilt, not heroism. The questioning was hostile, filled with leading questions and assumptions. When the doctor asked for a lawyer, they made him wait for hours. The public defender, who finally arrived, looked exhausted, carrying a stack of files under one arm and a cold cup of coffee in the other. He barely had time to review the case before the preliminary hearing. "Just take a plea deal," he suggested without much conviction, not even bothering to look up from his papers. "It'll be easier for everyone." But the young doctor refused. He knew he had done nothing wrong. He thought about his father, who had taught him to always stand up for the truth. What he didn't know was that his father, one of the city's most respected detectives, was away on an important case. He had no idea his son was sitting in a cell, accused of a crime he tried to prevent. As the sun rose over the city the next morning, the local news was already running with the story. "Local man arrested in connection with fatal shooting," the headlines read. They showed his mugshot but didn't mention his medical career or his attempt to save the victim. No one talked about how he had rushed to help while others ran away. The story they wanted to tell was already written, and the truth didn't fit their narrative. Little did anyone know, this case would soon shake the very foundation of the city's justice system. But for now, a young doctor sat in a holding cell, still wearing his scrubs stained with the blood of the man he tried to save, wondering how doing the right thing had gone so terribly wrong. The courthouse stood tall and intimidating against the morning sky, its stone steps worn from years of footsteps, some climbing toward justice, others descending in chains. Today, these same steps would witness another chapter in a story of corruption that had been brewing for years. Inside, behind heavy wooden doors, sat the judge who would decide the young doctor's fate. His chambers were elegant, filled with leather-bound law books and certificates that spoke of decades on the bench. But beneath this polished surface lay a web of secrets that would make any honest person's skin crawl. The judge had built his career on what he called being tough on crime, but there was more to the story. Every time he handed down a harsh sentence, the private prison just outside the city limits got a new resident. And every new resident meant more money flowing through a complex network of shell companies right into the judge's offshore accounts. This morning, like every morning, he sat at his desk reviewing case files. His coffee grew cold as he made calls to his real estate partners, discussing their latest investment, a new shopping center that would be built where a low-income housing project currently stood. "Don't worry about the residents," he assured them. "They won't be a problem much longer." The young doctor's case file sat on his desk, just another name in a stack of papers. The judge skimmed through it, already deciding the outcome before reading the details. To him, this was just another opportunity to show the city how tough he could be. The fact that the evidence was shaky didn't concern him. It never had before. In the courtroom, the public defender was drowning in paperwork. His desk was cluttered with dozens of cases, each one deserving more time than he could give. Dark circles under his eyes told the story of too many cases and too little sleep. He knew something wasn't right about this case, but with 50 other clients waiting, he barely had time to breathe, let alone investigate properly. Meanwhile, witnesses to the shooting were getting mysterious phone calls. "Maybe you didn't see things as clearly as you thought," the voices suggested. Others found envelopes in their mailboxes, some containing threats, others containing cash. By the end of the week, no one seemed to remember seeing the young doctor trying to save a life. The evidence that could have proven the doctor's innocence began to vanish like morning mist. The hospital security footage from that night? Mysteriously corrupted. The victim's belongings, which would have shown powder burns indicating the shooter was much closer than where the doctor had been. Lost in transit between departments. The doctor's blood-stained medical bag, full of equipment he used trying to save the victim. Nowhere to be found. The prosecution, however, had no trouble building their case. They painted a picture of a criminal hiding behind a white coat, using big words and complicated theories to explain away simple facts. They didn't mention that their star witness had changed his story 3 times, or that their timeline had more holes than a fishing net. Back in his chambers, the judge practiced his stern face in the mirror. He had perfected it over years of handing down harsh sentences. Tomorrow, he would use it again, not knowing that this time, his arrogance would begin his own undoing. He straightened his tie, rehearsing the speech he would give about law and order, about making examples of those who thought they were above the law. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered with signs demanding justice, but they were kept far from the building's steps. News cameras focused on the prosecution's carefully crafted statements, while ignoring the growing questions about missing evidence. The system moved forward like a well-oiled machine, grinding toward a conclusion that had been decided long before the first gavel fell. Little did the judge know, his carefully constructed world of power and corruption was about to meet its match. The young doctor's father wasn't just any detective. He was the kind who could piece together a puzzle that others didn't even know existed. But for now, the wheels of injustice continued to turn, their grinding sound drowned out by the bang of a gavel and the shuffle of chains. The trial began on a Monday morning, with the young doctor sitting at the defense table in a borrowed suit that hung loose on his frame. Weeks in jail had left their mark. His usually confident posture was now slouched, his eyes tired, but still holding on to hope. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as people filed in, some there for justice, others just for the show. The public defender shuffled through his papers one last time, knowing he was walking into a fight with one hand tied behind his back. He'd had only hours to prepare, while the prosecution had spent weeks building their case. The morning sunlight streaming through the high windows seemed to mock the darkness of what was about to unfold. "All rise," called the bailiff, and the judge swept in, his black robes flowing behind him like a shadow. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had already written the ending to this story. His gaze barely touched the young doctor as he took his seat, adjusting his reading glasses with practiced precision. The prosecution's opening statement was a masterpiece of manipulation. They spoke of community safety, of the need to take dangerous elements off the streets. They painted the young doctor as a wolf in sheep's clothing, someone who had used his position to hide his true nature. Every word was carefully chosen to plant seeds of doubt, to make the impossible seem probable. Then came the parade of witnesses, each one's testimony more troubled than the last. A store owner who had initially told police he saw the doctor trying to help the victim now claimed he saw something metallic in the doctor's hand. When the defense tried to point out this change, the judge quickly shut down the line of questioning. "Objection overruled" became the judge's favorite phrase that day. Each time the public defender tried to introduce evidence of the doctor's character, his years of volunteer work, his perfect record at the hospital, the lives he had saved, the judge found a reason to keep it from the jury. During lunch break, the young doctor sat alone in a holding cell, picking at a sandwich he couldn't taste. Through the small window, he could see a patch of sky and wondered if his father knew what was happening. He didn't know that evidence that could save him, security camera footage, witness statements, his medical bag, had vanished into the labyrinth of the justice system. The afternoon brought the prosecution's star witness, a man with a long criminal record who claimed he saw everything. The public defender had discovered this witness had recently had several serious charges mysteriously dropped, but when he tried to bring this up, the judge shut him down so fast it made heads spin. Irrelevant to the current proceedings, the judge declared, his words falling like hammer blows in the quiet courtroom. The jury didn't get to hear how this witness had changed his story 3 times, or about the late-night visit he received from certain officials promising to take care of his problems if he testified the right way. As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows, the defense's case crumbled like a sandcastle at high tide. Every piece of evidence that could have proved the doctor's innocence had been blocked, buried, or simply vanished. The public defender fought as best he could, but it was like trying to stop a landslide with a plastic spoon. The young doctor watched it all with growing despair, realizing that truth meant nothing in this courtroom. He thought about his patients, about the lives he'd saved and the ones he wouldn't be able to help now. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being condemned for trying to save a life. In the gallery, a few nurses from the hospital had come to support him, but they weren't allowed to testify about his character or his dedication to saving lives. They sat with tears in their eyes as they watched justice being twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable. The day ended with the defense resting its case, though resting felt like the wrong word for such a one-sided fight. The judge's satisfied smile as he adjourned for the day sent chills through everyone who saw it. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, but everyone in that courtroom knew what the verdict would be. Everyone except for one determined detective who was about to turn this whole corrupt system upside down. The day of sentencing arrived with a heavy silence hanging over the courthouse. Dark clouds gathered outside, as if nature itself was protesting what was about to happen. The young doctor stood before the court, his shoulders straight despite the weight of the wrongful guilty verdict pressing down on him. His medical degree, once proudly displayed on his office wall, now seemed like a distant dream. The courtroom was packed. Every wooden bench creaked under the weight of spectators, reporters, and fellow doctors who had come to support their colleague. The air felt thick with tension, making it hard to breathe. In the front row, an elderly patient the doctor had saved just months ago quietly wiped away tears with a trembling hand. The judge took his time settling into his chair, adjusting his robes with theatrical precision. His face wore the practiced expression of stern authority he had perfected over years of destroying lives. The sound of his gavel hitting the wooden block echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. "Will the defendant please rise?" the court clerk announced, her voice wavering slightly. She'd had seen many sentencings before, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way the young doctor's eyes still held compassion, even now, or how his hands that had saved countless lives, were now bound in cold metal handcuffs. The judge cleared his throat and began his speech, each word dripping with false righteousness. "In all my years on the bench," he began, shuffling his papers for dramatic effect, "I have rarely seen such a calculated betrayal of public trust." He went on about deterrence, about making examples, about protecting society. all while ignoring the hundred of letters from patients testifying to the doctor's character. Your medical license was not a shield behind which to hide criminal behavior, the judge continued, his voice rising with rehearsed indignation. It was a responsibility to help people, which you betrayed in the most fundamental way. The irony of his words was lost on no one who knew the truth. The young doctor was being condemned precisely for trying to help someone. The public defender shifted uncomfortably in his chair, knowing he had failed his client, but powerless to change what was happening. The stack of appeals paperwork in his briefcase felt inadequate against the machinery of injustice grinding forward before him. Then came the moment everyone had been dreading. The judge leaned forward, his reading glasses catching the fluorescent light. "It is the sentence of this court that you shall serve life imprisonment." The words fell like stones in a quiet pond, sending ripples of shock through the courtroom. Several nurses from the hospital's emergency room burst into tears. They remembered how the young doctor had worked 36 hours straight during the last city crisis, saving life after life without a single break. A senior surgeon stood up in protest, but was quickly silenced by the bailiff. The young doctor's voice, when he finally spoke, was steady despite everything. "I became a doctor to save lives," he said, looking directly at the judge. "That's all I was trying to do that night." The simplicity and truth of his words made them more powerful than any lengthy speech could have been. The judge, however, wasn't finished. He added special conditions to the sentence. The young doctor would serve his time in a maximum security facility, far from his home and family. Each word seemed chosen specifically to break not just the doctor's spirit, but the spirit of anyone who dared to challenge the system. As the bailiff led the young doctor away, an elderly man in the back of the courtroom watched with growing anger. Nobody noticed him, but this retired court clerk had seen enough corruption over the years to recognize its patterns. He clutched a small notebook filled with dates, names, and amounts. Information that would soon find its way to a certain detective's desk. The judge stood, ready to move on to his next case, completely unaware that his own countdown to justice had just begun. He didn't know that his perfect record of convictions was about to become evidence of his corruption, or that the son he had just sentenced was connected to the one person capable of bringing his whole corrupt empire crashing down. Outside, the gathering storm finally broke, rain streaming down the courthouse windows like tears. But somewhere in that dark sky, a light was about to break through. Justice, true justice, was already on its way. The detective's plane touched down late in the evening, the city lights twinkling below like scattered diamonds. After 6 months of working overseas on a special task force, he was finally home. His phone had been off during the long flight, and as he waited for it to power up, he had no idea his world was about to shatter. The first message made his heart stop. It was from his neighbor, asking if he'd heard what happened to his son. Then came the flood. Missed calls, text messages, voicemails, each one more urgent than the last. Standing in the middle of the busy airport, he felt the ground disappear beneath his feet as he read the news articles. His hands trembled as he flagged down a taxi. "Courthouse," he barked, his voice rough with emotion. Even at this late hour, he knew exactly where to start. He'd spent 30 years putting criminals behind bars, real criminals. The thought of his son, his only child, being wrongly imprisoned made his blood boil. The courthouse was nearly empty when he arrived, just a few cleaning staff mopping the floors. He knew every corner of this building, had testified in hundreds of cases here. Now these familiar halls felt like an enemy fortress. Using his badge, he gained access to the records room, where decades of case files lay waiting. Hours passed as he dug through his son's case file. His trained eye caught every inconsistency, every manipulated statement, every missing piece of evidence. Dawn was breaking when he discovered something that made him sit up straight. A pattern in the judge's previous cases. The same judge, the same corrupt system, the same missing evidence, over and over again. He pulled more files, creating stacks on the dusty floor. African American defendants, harsh sentences, missing evidence. The pattern was clear as day. His detective's mind started connecting dots that others had missed. Property records showed the judge's wife's company buying up land near the prison. Campaign contributions linked to private prison contractors. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. A cleaning lady found him there as the sun rose, surrounded by open files and scribbled notes. She'd known him for years, had seen him put away countless criminals. The look in his eyes now was different. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was personal. Back at his desk in the precinct, he started making calls. Old contacts, retired cops, courthouse employees who owed him favors. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle. A courthouse clerk slipped him information about the judge's private meetings. A retired bailiff remembered suspicious conversations. A court reporter had kept personal notes about cases that didn't seem right. He worked through the day without stopping, fueled by coffee and determination. His colleagues watched with concern as he filled a whiteboard with connections and evidence, his usual methodical approach now driven by desperate urgency. They'd never seen him like this. The legendary detective, who always kept his cool, was now a father fighting for his son. By evening, he had enough to start an official investigation. The pattern was undeniable. The judge had been running a sophisticated scheme for years. Every harsh sentence filled the private prison, driving up its value. Every filled cell meant more money flowing through shell companies. The whole system was rigged, and his son had become its latest victim. As night fell again, he sat at his desk, staring at a photo of his son in medical school graduation robes. The proud smile in the picture felt like a knife in his heart. His son had dedicated his life to saving others, and now he was paying the price for someone else's greed. But the detective had something the corrupt judge hadn't counted on: decades of experience, a network of loyal contacts. The detective's office became a war room. 3 weeks had passed since his discovery, and every wall was now covered with photos, documents, and red strings connecting the pieces of corruption. His coffee had gone cold again, the 4th cup today, but he barely noticed. He was too focused on the financial records spread across his desk. A soft knock at his door made him look up. His old partner stood there, concern etched on his weathered face. "You need to see this," he said, dropping a thick folder on the desk. Inside were bank statements showing monthly payments from an offshore account to the judge's beach house contractor. The amounts matched perfectly with the dates of harsh sentences handed down to young minority defendants. The detectives' team had grown. What started as a lone father's mission now included trusted colleagues who couldn't ignore the corruption once they saw it. A young tech expert worked late into the night, following digital breadcrumbs through shell companies. A retired court clerk provided years of private notes about suspicious patterns she'd observed but had been too afraid to report. In the evidence room, boxes piled up with proof. Security camera footage showed the judge meeting with private prison executives in underground parking lots. Audio recordings captured courthouse staff being threatened to lose evidence in specific cases. Email trails revealed property deals that always seemed to benefit from increased prison populations. The detective visited his son in prison every week, each visit strengthening his resolve. The young doctor was holding on, still finding ways to help others even behind bars. He'd started a medical education program for inmates, teaching basic first aid and health awareness. Even in darkness, he found ways to bring light. "Remember when you taught me to ride a bike?" his son asked during one visit. "You said the hardest part wasn't learning to pedal. It was learning to trust that you'd catch me if I fell." The detective felt his throat tighten. "I'm still here to catch you, son," he promised. "Just hold on a little longer." Back at the office, the evidence kept mounting. A prison guard with a conscience came forward, sharing stories of inmates who had been pressured to take plea deals by the judge's cronies. A real estate agent revealed how she'd been forced to help hide property purchases linked to the prison expansion. The detective's wall of evidence told a story that made his blood boil. The judge hadn't just corrupted the system. He turned it into a personal empire. Every harsh sentence filled another cell in the private prison. Every filled cell increased the prison's value. Every value increase meant more money flowing through hidden accounts. Late one night, as rain pattered against the office windows, the tech expert burst in with breakthrough news. She'd found encrypted emails between the judge and prison executives, discussing something called Operation Quota. The messages revealed a systematic plan to fill prison cells with minority defendants, using manipulated evidence and harsh sentences to meet private prison contract requirements. The detective's hand trembled as he read the emails. This wasn't just about his son anymore. This was about hundreds of lives destroyed by greed and corruption. Photos of families torn apart covered his desk. Mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters, all victims of a system rigged against them. His team worked around the clock, building an airtight case. They knew they'd only get one shot at this. The judge had powerful friends, people who benefited from his corruption. Taking him down would mean taking on the entire corrupt system he built. A young prosecutor, who had always suspected something was wrong but couldn't prove it, joined their cause. She helped prepare legal documents that would expose decades of judicial misconduct. Her hands shook as she reviewed the evidence. This case would shake the entire legal system to its core. As dawn broke over the city, the detective stood at his office window, watching the sunrise. In his hand was a photo of his son in medical school, smiling proudly in his white coat. Soon, very soon, that smile would return. But first, they had to tear down the walls of corruption, brick by brick, document by document, truth by truth. His phone buzzed. The FBI had agreed to meet. Tomorrow, they would present their evidence. Tomorrow, the first domino would fall in a chain that would expose decades of corruption. Tomorrow, justice would begin its slow but certain march toward truth. The meeting with FBI agents took place in a secure room at their field office, blinds drawn against the morning sun. The detective laid out box after box of evidence, each one telling a part of the corrupt judge's story. The lead FBI agent, a woman with sharp eyes and 30 years of experience, studied every document with growing concern. "This goes deeper than we thought," she said, holding up a file linking the judge to 3 different private prison companies. The detective nodded, spreading out photographs across the conference table. Security camera stills showed late-night meetings between the judge and prison executives in parking garages, envelopes changing hands in shadows. News of the investigation spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Staff members who had stayed quiet for years suddenly found their courage. A clerk approached the detective during his lunch break, hands shaking as she handed over a thumb drive. "I've been keeping records," she whispered. "Things that didn't seem right. Cases where evidence just disappeared." The judge's carefully built world started crumbling. Other victims of his corruption began coming forward. A mother whose son had received a harsh sentence for a minor offense shared recordings of threatening phone calls warning her to stay quiet. A former court reporter revealed notebooks full of conversations she'd overheard, conversations that proved the fix was in. The state's Judicial Review Board called an emergency meeting. The detective presented his findings, his voice steady as he exposed years of systematic corruption. He showed them property records revealing how the judge's family had gotten rich from prison contracts. Bank statements proved money flowing through shell companies. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the corrupt judge's coffin. Local media caught wind of the story. Headlines screamed about judicial misconduct and rigged trials. The detective's phone rang constantly with reporters seeking comments, but he stayed focused on his mission. This wasn't about headlines. It was about justice. In his prison cell, the young doctor watched the news unfold on a small TV in the common area. Other inmates gathered around, many recognizing their own cases in the pattern of corruption being exposed. Some had tears in their eyes, finally seeing hope after years of feeling forgotten by the system. The judge tried to fight back. His expensive lawyers filed motions to suppress evidence. His friends in high places suddenly couldn't return phone calls. The same system he had manipulated for years was now turning against him. His carefully constructed facade of respectability began to crack. One rainy evening, a former prison guard requested to meet the detective. They sat in a quiet diner, and the guard's hands trembled as he spoke about inmates being pressured to plead guilty, about evidence being planted, about a quota system that demanded more prisoners to keep profits flowing. His testimony would prove invaluable. The FBI investigation expanded, pulling threads that led to more corruption. Real estate developers who had profited from prison expansion found their records subpoenaed. Bank officials who had helped hide money were brought in for questioning. The whole corrupt network was being exposed to light. A young investigative reporter did some digging and discovered similar patterns in other jurisdictions. The story wasn't just about one corrupt judge anymore. It was about a systemic problem that had destroyed countless lives. The detective's evidence became the key to uncovering a nationwide scandal. The pressure mounted on the judge. His friends abandoned him one by one, not wanting to be caught in the fallout. His private phone calls were filled with panic as he realized the depth of evidence against him. The same fear he had instilled in so many innocent defendants was now keeping him awake at night. In the detective's office, a wall of photos showed faces of hope, people wrongly convicted who might soon see justice. Among them, his son's picture reminded him why this fight mattered. Every late night, every dead end, every small victory was worth it. The system that had swallowed up so many innocent lives was finally facing its own judgment day. A knock at his door brought new information. Internal emails showing the judge had tried to destroy evidence when he realized he was being investigated. But it was too late. The truth was already out, spreading like sunrise after a long, dark night. Justice, real justice, was finally within reach. The judge's world collapsed on a quiet Tuesday morning. FBI agents surrounded his mansion before dawn, their vehicles silent until the last moment. As they led him out in handcuffs, his silk pajamas a far cry from his usual black robes, neighbors peeked through curtains at the fall of a man who'd thought himself untouchable. Inside his home, agents discovered a hidden room behind his study's bookshelf. There, meticulously organized files revealed the full scope of his corruption. Spreadsheets tracked payments from private prisons, each harsh sentence matched with a corresponding deposit. The evidence the detective had uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. The courthouse buzzed with whispers as news spread. Staff members who had feared the judge for years watched security footage of him being processed like any other criminal. His vacant courtroom, once a chamber of injustice, felt lighter somehow, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. The detective received the news in his office while reviewing more case files. His phone lit up with messages from his team, but he took a moment to look at his son's photo before responding. "We're almost there," he whispered to the image of the young doctor in his white coat. More dominoes began to fall. A prison executive, seeing no escape, agreed to testify. He spoke for hours about secret meetings, about how they had targeted specific communities, about how each filled cell meant more profit. His testimony implicated other judges, other officials, revealing a network of corruption that stretched across the state. The judge's private calendar revealed weekly meetings with real estate developers. They had worked together, using inside information about planned arrests to buy property in neighborhoods they knew would be hit hardest. As families were torn apart by harsh sentences, these men had grown rich on their pain. A court clerk, finally free from fear, brought forward a recording of the judge laughing about sentencing guidelines. "Who means evidence?" his voice sneered through the tape. "When you have power." The same voice that had condemned so many now condemned himself. Local news stations camped outside the federal building as more arrests were made. Property developers in handcuffs, prison executives doing the perp walk, corrupt officials trying to hide their faces from cameras. The detective watched from his window, remembering every family torn apart by their greed. In the prison's visiting room, the detective sat across from his son, sharing the news of each new development. The young doctor's eyes filled with tears when he learned how many other lives had been affected. Even now, facing his own injustice, his first thought was for others. The hardest part, the young doctor said, isn't being here. It's knowing how many others are here with me. All of us separated from our families because of one man's greed. His words echoed what the detective had felt throughout the investigation. This was bigger than any one case. Back at the FBI office, agents uncovered offshore accounts hiding millions. Each transaction told a story of justice sold to the highest bidder. The judge's luxury cars, his vacation homes, his art collection, all bought with the currency of ruined lives. The state governor called a press conference announcing a complete review of every case the judge had presided over. Families who had lost hope began to see a light at the end of their long tunnel. Support groups formed, sharing stories of loved ones locked away on flimsy evidence and harsh sentences. Late one night, as the detective reviewed another stack of cases, his old partner brought in a key piece of evidence. An email chain showed the judge coordinating with prison officials before trials even began, deciding outcomes before hearing any evidence. It was the smoking gun they needed. The judge's lawyer called, hinting at a deal. But the detective stood firm. This wasn't about making deals, it was about exposing every dark corner of corruption. Too many lives had been destroyed to settle for anything less than complete justice. As the sun set over the city, the detective added another photo to his wall, the judge's mugshot. Next to it, hundreds of faces looked back at him, each one a life touched by corruption. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more arrests, more steps toward justice. But tonight, for the first time in months, he allowed himself to smile. The truth was winning. Spring sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows as the state Supreme Court convened for its historic decision. The room was packed with families who had waited years for this moment. The detective sat in the front row, his badge polished, his heart racing with anticipation. The Chief Justice's voice rang clear through the hushed courtroom. In light of overwhelming evidence of judicial misconduct, this court hereby overturns all convictions handled by the corrupt judge over the past 15 years. The words echoed off the marble walls like music. Sobs of joy and relief filled the air as people hugged each other, years of pain finally finding release. Outside, news crews captured the moment as prison transport buses arrived one by one. Each carried people whose lives had been stolen by corruption, now returning to their families. The young doctor was among the first to step into freedom, his father waiting with open arms. Their embrace spoke of pain, love, and triumph. A moment photographers would later call justice restored. The corrupt judge faced his own sentencing in the same courthouse where he had condemned so many others. Gone were his expensive suits and arrogant smile, replaced by a prison jumpsuit and downcast eyes. The federal judge, a woman known for her fairness, read out his crimes: corruption, bribery, civil rights violations, obstruction of justice. His sentence: 30 years without parole. The young doctor's hospital welcomed him back with open arms. His medical license was restored with a formal apology from the state medical board. That first morning, as he put on his white coat again, nurses and fellow doctors lined the hallway applauding. Many had tears in their eyes, remembering how he had been taken from them in handcuffs that terrible night. But the story didn't end there. The doctor and his father turned their experience into a mission. Together, they established a foundation to help other victims of judicial corruption. The detective's investigative skills and the doctor's compassion proved a powerful combination. They provided legal aid, counseling, and support to families torn apart by corrupt officials. The prison system itself faced a complete overhaul. Private prison contracts were canceled, and new oversight measures were put in place. The detective's evidence had exposed not just one corrupt judge, but an entire system built on profit from human suffering. Reform bills passed, ensuring that justice could no longer be bought and sold. At the foundation's first community meeting, people shared their stories. A grandmother spoke about raising her grandchildren while their mother served time on false charges. A young man described losing years of his life for a crime he didn't commit. The young doctor listened to each story, his own experience helping him understand their pain and hope. The detective's investigation became a model for fighting corruption nationwide. Other police departments requested training, learning how to spot signs of judicial misconduct. His methodical approach to gathering evidence, combined with his unwavering dedication to justice, helped expose corrupt judges in other states. 1 year after his release, the young doctor performed life-saving surgery on a child whose family couldn't afford care. The foundation covered the costs. As he left the operating room, successful operation complete, he passed the wall where newspaper articles told his story. From prison to purpose, read one headline, showing him and his father standing together outside the foundation's new building. The detective eventually retired from active duty, but his work continued. He devoted himself to the foundation, mentoring young investigators and helping families navigate the justice system. His desk, once covered with evidence of corruption, now held thank-you letters from families reunited, lives rebuilt. As autumn leaves fell outside the foundation's windows, father and son sat together, reviewing new cases. "You know," the young doctor said, "that night when I tried to save that shooting victim, I thought I was just doing my job. I never imagined it would lead to all this." His father smiled, remembering their journey. "Sometimes," he replied, "the worst injustice leads to the greatest change." The story of the detective and his son became a beacon of hope, proving that truth could triumph over corruption, that justice, real justice, was worth fighting for. In courthouses across the country, their story reminded judges, lawyers, and officials that every decision affected real lives, real families, real futures. And in the city where it all began, a new generation of legal professionals took an oath not just to uphold the law, but to protect the truth at any cost. The corrupt judge's dark legacy had been transformed into a light guiding others toward justice, proving that even the darkest night must yield to dawn.